faces. And I'm going to share my screen with you. Give me a sec. Oh, I didn't prep it. One sec. Not row. Awesome. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. And let's do it. So thanks for coming to my 7th and final workshop of this fall quarter. I've taught a bunch of these now on all different topics, and I am planning on doing more in winter. So if you're ever interested in joining, got a lot of them planned. My name's Kirsten. Both of you know that. Actually, I think we all know each other unless anyone else shows up. I would like to start this presentation off by acknowledging that we are fortunate to be able to study and work on the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Chumash people. Much of the knowledge that I share in these workshops comes from traditional ecological knowledge, preserved and passed down through thousands of years by Indigenous peoples. I hope this presentation can do justice to that tradition of sharing knowledge about how to live off and protect the land, while also acknowledging that the past and present original inhabitants of this land have been irrevocably harmed by those who arrived on their territory. I realize that these are just words, but I do hope that these words can create awareness and be a step towards future change. Today's workshop specifically is called Fire, Ecology, and Natural Succession. Oh, I had to get lopsided. The purpose of this workshop is to discuss something that's near and dear to many of our hearts, especially those of us that live in California. I don't know where you're from, Joel, but yeah, the workshop is going to talk about how the natural world recovers after wildfire. We're going to talk a little bit about how fires work and the effects on ecosystems and how they kind of reform or change post-fire. I do kind of have a lot of like then versus now examples, like pre-climate change or pre-human and like heavy human like Western involvement, and then now like what we're kind of looking at and kind of bad effects. And I do kind of know that wildfires, especially to those people that live in California, Australia, other places, the Amazon, that are super affected, these can be kind of scary and personal. And I want this to be a safe space. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by anything I say, just take a break, leave the call, whatever you need to do. If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it. Otherwise, please feel free to type any questions, comments, or concerns into the chat. Oh, I guess I should get that open. Or if I ask you to turn your mic on, you can do that as well. Thank you. All right, we're going to start off. What do you each want to take away from today's workshop? Do you have any questions to start off? Are you here to learn about fires or to see like maybe I don't know. What are you doing here?
Learning new stuff.
Learning new stuff. That's a good reason.
Yeah, I think kind of like what you touched on, just to get like a little bit of historical context maybe on like how fire has been handled over the years.
Awesome. All right. What about you, Joel, if you want to share? Oh, you texted message, sorry. And Joel wants to learn more about, Joelle, I might be saying your name wrong, I'm so sorry, about our fire and ecosystem. Awesome. So, what is fire ecology? This is a branch of ecology that focuses on the origins of wildland fire and its relationship to the environment that surrounds it, both living and non-living, biotic, abiotic. There's lots of kind of pros and cons depending on the ecosystem. In places where wildfires are part of the natural ecological succession, the ecological benefits clearly outweigh the negatives. Regular occurrence of fires can reduce amount of fuel buildup, thereby lowering the likelihood of a potential large wildfire. Fires often also remove alien plants, non-native plants, invasive plants that compete with our native ones for nutrients and space. And they remove undergrowth, which allows sunlight to reach the floor, thereby promoting the growth of native species. The ashes that remain after a fire can add lots of good nutrients back into the soil that were kind of locked into those older, that older vegetation, maybe even dead vegetation, and now it's returning to the soil and other plants can use it to grow. Fires can also provide a good way for controlling insect pests and fungi pests by killing off older or diseased trees and leaving the younger, healthier ones. In addition to all of these benefits, the burned trees can provide habitat for birds and small mammals. When these trees decay, they also end up getting added back to the soil as good nutrients. Overall, fires are pretty great for promoting biological diversity and healthy ecosystems. It fosters new plant growth, and wildlife populations can expand as a result. That being said, there's obviously cons to everything. And for the most part, in places where fires are good and natural, the cons are fairly limited and kind of are related to soil damage, soil erosion, or the increased spread of invasive species. For the most part, though, this is only if the fires are coming too often or if they're occurring in places where they're not supposed to happen. Because, as we said, usually fire that's natural is good for soil and for killing invasives. Okay, what is a fire regime? This is kind of an important word. You hear it thrown around a lot when talking about natural fires, wildfires that are supposed to happen. But basically, fire regime refers to the patterns of a fire that occur over long periods of time and the immediate effects of that fire on the ecosystem in which it occurs. There are many ways to define a fire regime. Fire, it's usually a function of frequency of fire occurrence, fire intensity, and the amount of fuel consumed. Kind of going in deeper, what is the frequency that we just mentioned? That's one of the it's one of the part of the function of fire regime. I just died. The frequency is determined largely by ecosystem characteristics, the duration and character of the weather, is the soil drier or wetter than normal, and ignition sources. The other part of the function is intensity. This is determined by the quantity of fuel available, the fuel's combustion rates, and existing weather conditions. Interactions between frequency and intensity are influenced by wind, topography, and fire history. There are many other factors that can come into play, but these are kind of the main ones that kind of help you get a good idea of what's going on. I want to give you some examples of our kind of fire regimes that are pretty often found in the United States. There are your dry coniferous forests. The natural fire regime is about a 15 to 20 year frequency with a low to medium intensity. Subalpine, you're going to have higher intensity, but very, very infrequent, every 50 to 300 years. It kind of depends on the specific vegetation, but some of these plants have evolved, all of the plants in these places have evolved to react to fire in positive ways to allow the species to survive. And your mid-elevation forests, which are kind of in between your dry coniferous and your subalpine, those, although there's a lot of variation, they do have 25 to 250 year frequency. And I think this mid-elevation forest, they tend to be a little bit more varied in species type. That all being said, our modern fire regimes are pretty degraded. They've changed a lot. Often, pretty much every single one of these, in response to human activities. if it's not climate change, it's overgrazing or timber production or, you know, a bunch of other things, fire suppression, intentional, like stopping of fires from going through. And these, well, in the dry coniferous forests, which have the shortest fire regime cycle, you know, we've seen that these skip cycles lead to more intense fires, build up of fuel, and kind of different non-natural densities of forests with different species than should naturally be there. Your subalpine forests and your mid-elevation forests have a long enough fire interval frequency that we don't really know the effects yet on what's going to happen. But considering that most of the human activities in these different kinds of forests are pretty similar, they're probably going to have similar effects in the long run. Wildfires occur naturally in many parts of the world and are often an important part of ecosystems. This fire distribution map is kind of an example, like the yellow zones are fire dependent ecosystems. So these are areas that evolved around the need for fire, or at least the fire exists and the plants had to evolve to live in it properly. The green zone's fire sensitive. That kind of means the fires aren't very common, and when they do happen, they're pretty damaging. And then fire independent ecosystems, which are the brown zones, are either so dry, so wet, or so cold that fires just don't happen ever, and probably never will happen unless climate change just really messes them up. But so like this is kind of what your like natural, like what it should be, where the fires should be happening are the yellow zones. But each zone obviously has its own kind of regime, frequency, etc. That being said, you know, we're still wondering, why is California and similar places, why are they on fire so often? And that's kind of every year more and more fires are occurring. And even though these fires are natural, they're not natural anymore. You know, we've messed up the ecosystems so much that the fires are coming too frequently or not frequently enough. They're too hot or not hot enough. And so it's kind of messing up all the ecology of the local ecosystems. For example, so we've got kind of like two ecosystem types or like plant species groupings in California that want fire, basically, but not too much fire, right? So your first one is the Southwestern California chaparral, which probably most of us have heard of. Chaparral. It's kind of our like shrubby, oily, dense plant type that kind of inhabit the Los Padres for the most part. This is kind of also seen elsewhere in the southwest of the United States, and usually grows in places that are Mediterranean-like climate with hot, dry summers, mild, wet winters. This stuff is generally fire-induced and grows in soils that are shallow and unable to hold water. The natural fire regime in these areas occur about every 15 to 25 years. So that's pretty high regularity. And this is kind of, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons, but Santa Ana winds, the dry summer months that kind of allow the plants to dry out, and the just general like drought that we're kind of always in, all allow this fire regime to occur naturally. But when we as humans stop fires from happening as often as they should, which has been what's been happening, this greater than 20-year interval causes more buildup of dead, dry, oily shrubs that are super flammable, and this causes higher intensity, longer, bigger fires. And that's kind of what we've been seeing. Every year we've got the next biggest fire in California's history, you know? That second ecosystem I mentioned is the Ponderosa pine ecosystem, which is kind of southwest, Intermountain West. These are also found elsewhere on the west and east, or west, sorry, on the west coast and kind of mountains west of the Dakotas. This is a kind of a specific taller tree type. It's not shrubs. They're kind of more coniferous. And these generally are surviving with under 25 inches of rain a year or snow. This also has a fire regime cycle of 5 to 25 years. Actually, it's a little bit, I guess the last one was 15 to 25. This one is 5 to 25. So these are kind of moderate regularity, or to very regular. And these fires are usually low intensity ground fires that actually burn the grasses and shrubs that grow under these trees, like in the understory. And these are supposed to kind of burn pretty quickly and just burn those grasses and understory plants. But when we manage fires by not allowing them to happen, all of that, like, lower understory kind of gets super, super dense, and if a fire does catch, the fire is much, much more intense than it should be and can actually burn the trees. And the trees aren't really meant to survive high intensity fires, just very low intensity ones. So yeah, it's not good. It's not good, it's not great. Wildfires are natural, sometimes. Here, it's a pretty low quality map, I apologize. But here is a map to compare our natural fire regime map to. The red areas are where fire regimes are degraded, as in, like, very, very degraded, as in they're not at all what they should be. And that can either mean more fires, bigger fires, fires where there were none ever before. And then anywhere that's green is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. This is how it should be. So that's either the fires are just as they should, the fires are just as they should be. So if there were no fires before, there still are no fires. And if there were fires at 15-year intervals, there still are fires at 15-year intervals, if that kind of makes sense. So I'm gonna just kind of show you that first the natural fire distribution map. This is kind of what it's supposed to be. You know, you can see how the Amazon down in South America, the fires aren't natural there, but check out what it is today. There's a bunch of fires. The fire regime is messed up. It's pretty bad. That's just a good example because the colors are pretty obvious. But it's kind of true all over the world, right? And something to consider, approximately 90% of fires in the last 10 years have been human caused, you know, whether it's on accident or not. And only about 10% of fires are caused by lightning strikes, which are kind of how fires start naturally in the world. Different cultures have different ways of interacting with wildfires. I'm going to kind of just touch on the two main ones that we experience in the United States. And these two have very different ways of dealing with fire. So you obviously have Indigenous land management, which unfortunately is, well, actually, basically for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, Indigenous people were managing the land in the ways that they were. And some of what they did in some areas in the United States was managing through intentional burns, like intentionally burning the land. And this both benefited the ecosystem as well as the Indigenous people because it helped them kind of pick and choose where they wanted certain foods to grow, either through agriculture or through kind of just cultivation that we would not recognize necessarily as agriculture. And I'm not saying that everything they did or do still is perfect and great and amazing, but I do think that many of the traditions that they follow and followed did manage the land sustainably, as opposed to modern land management, which, as we can see, is not ideal. Unfortunately, when Europeans arrived, they found fire tending, fire land management to be barbaric, as they did many other indigenous customs. And so this kind of like this way of land management was stopped, like wasn't allowed to happen. And this led to all these environmental issues I've mentioned and kind of will mention. But yeah, so I mean, the lack of forest management as well as over-management has led to bigger, more intense, less controlled, and more damaging fires. And of course, not everything we've done is bad. There are many groups and many scientists out there trying to figure out better, more sustainable ways to manage the land. But past and current land management is still, I think, not up to par, potentially, with what it should be to help our ecosystems survive, as well as to keep our people safe. Did anyone have any questions so far?
I guess it just sounds like no matter what, when there's people on the land, like we're going to affect change to some extent. It's going to like alter the regular cycle. But the idea here is that it is better to do more like figure out a system of more like control burn than it is to try to like prevent fires from happening. Is that the idea?
Kind of. I mean, I personally don't really get into how we should be managing the land in this presentation, because I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that. That being said, if I had to have an opinion, I do think that controlled burns are better. Like having the burn happen, as long as you're doing it correctly, you're doing it at the right interval, you're doing it at the right intensity, which I'm sure is very difficult to make happen properly, right? If all of that is coming together, it's got to be better than what we're doing now, which is completely stopping fires from happening and then allowing and doing nothing else, and then that allows like horrible like destructive fires to come through the land. I mean, like, I've never really been a proponent of cutting down trees just to cut down trees, but I do think there might be something to be said for taking some trees out so that you're not allowing as much like tinder and fuel. And that's like a highly scientific, I would have no idea where to start, you know. That's why scientists are out there trying to figure it out. But yeah. Anyone else? Cool. Well, if you do, just type in the chat. All right, so landscape succession after fires. As you can see in this image, there's kind of a typical, I guess, this is kind of a generic succession pattern after a fire. The fire, you know, starts out, it kind of just burns all the top layer of vegetation, but this usually leaves some soil with added nutrients from the ash, as well as most of the seed bank and root bank that was in the soil, which allows this next step of annual plants, grasses, and some other kinds of plants to come back up first after a fire. And then you kind of move on your kind of woody geophytic shrubs and seedlings of trees. So anything that, for the most part, was able to survive under the soil, those can pop up next. And that eventually kind of, they crowd out those annuals and grasses, and you get a kind of like taller ecosystem type. So trees, maybe big shrubs, like taller shrubs. Then you kind of, your final step is kind of a more varied. You've got trees, but you've also got shrubs, but you've also got grasses. And of course, this is kind of like every ecosystem's different, and succession patterns depend on species, water, sun, nutrients, fire intensity, frequency, and so many more things. But this is kind of like a good example of what you see in our two ecosystems that are like fire dependent, your dry coniferous and your chaparral. So I guess the chaparral doesn't really become trees, but the chaparral is your tallest, your step 8. I am not an animal person at all. So I'm just going to mention animals and wildfires in passing. But I also do think that there isn't very much to say about animals in response to wildfire. The immediate impact of wildfires on animals is generally less intense because vertebrates and invertebrates can usually avoid being burned in the fire. They can move, they can get out of there. Obviously, some will get caught in the fire, but many of them can get out. But that being said, major changes in the plant communities and ecosystems in response to fires really do impact animal communities. So like over time, well, a good example I found was like bison probably moved to the eastern United States due to Native Americans like doing certain kinds of controlled burns on the land. And it allowed more grasslands for the bison to eat. And so they spread into these new areas. I don't know. I thought that was kind of cool. But yeah, so basically, for the most part, fires don't. Oh, thank you for coming. But yeah, the animals aren't as affected, basically, in the end. There are so many ways that plants respond evolutionarily to fires, and I think they're super cool, and I don't have them all here, but I have a lot of them because I love plants. But I kind of have like two major like distinctions. I've got evolutionary developments that prevent individual plants from dying, and the next one is going to be evolutionary developments that prevent species of plants from dying. So I'll kind of get into that in a second. The individual plant, like evolutionary development, my first one here for you is something called Cladoptis. Cladoptis, I have no idea how to say that. But basically, for all of us, the word self-pruning is kind of a good one. Basically, the plant sheds branches that are diseased or already dead to stop the drain of resources on the plant, but also to keep fires from burning the rest of the plant. So for example, the ponderosa pine, which we have in California, these ones shed their dead and lower branches to keep fires from catching on those branches and burning the whole tree down. That again, I think this is like one of those species that kind of belongs in they only live in areas with low intensity fires. And so if you had a high intensity one, you could burn this tree down, but the low intensity grass ones aren't able to catch the branches because they aren't low enough to the ground. Some plants have fire resistant tissues. My example here, California redwood, but also kind of oaks and other trees. They have really high levels of tannins or other chemicals in their bark that act as a natural flame retardant. And, you know, I mean, I don't know, Peter, if you've ever seen them, but Mason, you probably have, like redwoods that are like burned until they're hollow. but they're still alive. And it's pretty amazing. Some plants have high water content. We usually call these succulent plants, which are not just the succulents you can buy in the grocery store, but there's many actually like native wild ones. We've got some native agaves and yucca and such like that. And these can help, the succulent high water content help these plants not dry out when heat from fire or smoke from fire is near. And sometimes this allows them to survive the low intensity quick fires or fires that just, you know, kind of, I don't know if you've ever seen, like, some trees will kind of get singed even if the fire didn't touch them, just because the air got so hot, and this high water content would help them from getting singed and dying. Lots of big words. Obligate sprouters, also known as like woody resprouters, are another evolutionary development that some plants have. These are able to survive fires as genetic individuals, so the plant itself survives by replacing the above ground tissue structures by resprouting from meristems, which are like how the plant kind of just like parts of the plant that can develop new cells basically. But these were insulated underground and didn't burn during the fire. Resprouting is promoted by conditions that do not favor seeds surviving, and that's usually like places where the fires are pretty rare. One of our examples in California, certain species of Ceanothus resprout, and they actually want to burn as quickly as possible so that their roots and below ground structures don't burn. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. Like, the shorter amount of time the above ground plant spends burning, the less likely the below ground plant will burn because the soil won't burn. And so the Ceanothus actually has flammable resins in their leaves and branches that make it burn faster so that it can resprout later on. And my last plant type that is that allows the individual to survive a fire are kind of geophytes, which sometimes geophytes and resprouters kind of go hand in hand and sometimes not. But these are pretty important post-fire flora. These taxa like respond to fire by resprouting from bulbs, just like they would after a cold winter, a frost, or like a drought. And so it's kind of a end all, what's the word? Like, it kind of solves a lot of problems having a bulb that it can resprout from. But many geophytes, like the Mariposa lily, can survive. And Mariposa lily, there's a bunch of different colors and flavors and shapes of them. So this is kind of like one of the weirder ones, but you've probably seen them if you've been in California during spring. All right, now my, I believe, final section is plants developments that allow the species to survive, but not the individual plant. So this is usually like related to seeds instead of underground storage of roots or bulbs. The Ceanothus, so we had that above, but some species of Ceanothus don't resprout. They actually seed. They're obligate seeders instead of obligate resprouters. And so Ceanothus store their seeds kind of in the soil, and they're usually heat resistant, so they can resprout after a fire because they didn't burn. This allows certain kinds of plants, this evolutionary development allows certain kinds of plants to survive higher intensity fires. Other kinds of obligate seeders actually keep their seeds in their canopy instead of in the soil. The canopy is in like the top of the tree. And this is kind of like, if the fire kills the plant, the tree, and the tree falls over, those seeds are going to hit the ground and they'll be able to sprout from there. And so the idea is that the fire probably wouldn't get big enough to burn the canopy of the tree. I don't know. It apparently works, but it's kind of cool. We'll see a plant that I would call a canopy obligate cedar in a second. But plants with heat or smoke stimulated germination require fires to actually germinate their seeds. Things like plants like the chamise, which we have as one of our chaparral plants, produces dormant seeds that require fire for scarification, which basically means that the fire is needed to crack the seed open enough for like roots or leaves to pop out. This plant's also like pretty highly flammable, so it will catch on fire and will burn intentionally. The Monterey cypress is a good example of serotiny, which is the response of seed release from seed capsules that only respond to fire or smoke. This plant is actually so dependent on fires to release their seeds from the really, really hard shells that they are on the verge of extinction because Monterey doesn't burn very often anymore. And they're very specific. They're just native to that one area. This is the plant that also keeps their seeds in the canopy storage. Until the tree burns, those seeds probably won't even ever reach the ground, or unless smoke releases the seeds, but they won't even touch the ground, which is kind of interesting. I got two more ones for you. Paraphytic annuals, or aka fire followers. These have deeply dormant seeds that require smoke for germination. The California fire poppy is one of those pretty rare plants that only pops up for a short amount of time and only pops up after a fire. They're actually very beautiful, but you are pretty rarely going to see them. The last one's super funky. It's called, I don't even know how to say it, Myrmecori, I don't know. But this is an example of like evolutionary convergence in which ants and plants like need each other to survive. And so certain kinds of plants, ants eat certain kinds of seeds from certain kinds of plants and like bring them to new places that are far enough away from fires or deep enough under the ground from fires that they don't burn, but they can still resprout. And I couldn't actually find a good example of a California one, but I do know that there's like 3,000 species that have this like interaction with ants. So it's pretty cool. But we're pretty much out of time. So I want to thank you all for coming. I'm done with workshops for this quarter, but in January, I will be starting again. I'm shortening the title to Nature Awareness Series. It'll be a little bit less adventure related, I think. I'm not sure. But yeah, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay.
Yeah, I hope you got overloaded with information like I did.
It was very interesting, actually. I really like it.
Yeah, no, that was pretty cool. Sweet. So that was the last one of the quarter, right?
Yep, November 20th. That was it.
And then next quarter, hopefully we're at a time that like is Tuesdays at 8 is like that's the final time we figured out.
Yeah, I mean we can talk about it.
No, that's cool. I know Ren was moving it around a bunch, but
yeah, my job I don't learn until the week before, and I can be working between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. No, I wouldn't work the whole day, but that's like the day.
Right. Cool.
So yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Have a good weekend, I guess.
There you go.
Bye.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye. You too.